At a weathered estate sale in Texas, a gentleman purchases an aged wallet without any expectations, but within he discovers a crumpled slip of paper, a rental receipt for a safety deposit vault in Richmond, Virginia, dated June 1990. That date activates something simultaneously. An armored vehicle with more than $1 million vanished and was never located again. No culprits, no corpses, no evidence, merely a legend. The wallet leads to a vault that was never accessed and a path that indicates someone who had been concealed in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. In June of 1990, the city of Richmond, Virginia, became the setting for one of the most puzzling cases in its criminal record. Atlantic Secure Transit, a private armored transportation company, conducted routine cash transfers between major retail establishments and regional banks. That summer, one of its armored vehicles departed on what was anticipated to be a standard route, gathering deposits from various grocery stores around the city and transporting them to Southern Federal Bank. The vehicle never arrived. There were 2 men in the vehicle. Behind the wheel was Elroy Martin, an experienced security officer recognized for his discipline and rigid adherence to company procedures. He had accumulated over 15 years in cash transportation, a veteran respected by both his supervisors and clients. Accompanying him that day was Kenny Tate, a fresh recruit aged 25, recently employed and still within his initial month of service. Despite his limited background, Tate had cleared all background investigations and preliminary training without problems. According to official dispatch records, the vehicle left the facility shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. It was filled progressively at multiple locations, gathering proceeds from several chain grocery establishments. The total sum on board was documented as $1.1 million in bundled currency. Sometime in the late morning, all contact from the vehicle stopped. The vehicle failed to arrive at the scheduled banking institution, and radio silence continued beyond the permitted time frame. Atlantic Secure Transit's dispatch team activated standard emergency procedures. Multiple efforts were made to contact the crew via radio, but neither Martin nor Tate replied. By mid-afternoon, the company alerted the Richmond Police Department. Officers were sent to survey the projected route, concentrating on the last confirmed stop. Roadblocks were temporarily established on key highways exiting the city. No tire impressions, abandoned vehicles, or accident reports were discovered. Witnesses from earlier locations confirmed observing the armored vehicle, with both men appearing composed and professional. Then the trail disappeared. The initial 24 hours produced no significant leads. No ransom demand, no witness accounts of unusual activity, no sudden alerts from the banking institutions. The vehicle and its contents had apparently disappeared. Then, on the second day, a development, though not the one authorities had anticipated. The vehicle was discovered on the far side of a desolate industrial park, positioned between 2 corroding shipping containers behind a long abandoned warehouse. The location was unmonitored, rarely frequented, and provided easy concealment from public roads. The vehicle was secured. The armored vehicle was vacant. Neither of the 2 guards were inside. Both had disappeared without leaving behind a trace. The vehicle displayed no signs of forced access, and nothing inside suggested a struggle had occurred. The rear vault was empty, accessed without damage, and the keys were absent. Both service firearms, standard issue .38 revolvers assigned to the crew, were missing. No blood, no discarded materials, and no personal belongings remained in the cabin. It was as if the vehicle had simply been parked and deserted. At that point, both Elroy Martin and Kenny Tate were officially recorded as missing. With no indication of what had occurred to them, investigators could not determine whether they had been overpowered, coerced, or willingly participated. What began as a missing vehicle had now escalated into a comprehensive investigation, with 2 men gone, $1 million unaccounted for, and no direction to pursue. 2 days later, Local fishermen found a body floating near the eastern embankment of the James River. Police divers retrieved the remains, later identified as Elroy Martin. The victim was still wearing the uniform of Atlantic Secure Transit. A single gunshot wound to the back of the skull was clearly visible. There were no signs of struggle on the body, and no weapon was recovered from the river. The area where the body was discovered offered no additional evidence, no shell casing, no discarded belongings, and no indication that the killing had occurred there. It was clear the body had been dumped, but the location of the actual crime remained unknown. The implications were immediate and grave. Investigators considered several theories. An external robbery seemed increasingly improbable. The absence of eyewitnesses or vehicle sightings suggested a premeditated act involving at least one insider. The precision of the vault access indicated someone familiar with protocols. The use of a remote abandoned lot, the absence of blood in the vehicle, and the quiet efficiency of the operation all suggested planning rather than chaos. Suspicion quickly focused on Kenny Tate. His disappearance, combined with the forensic vacuum left behind, raised difficult questions. There was no record of Kenny Tate contacting his family, friends, or employer after the incident. No letters or phone calls had been received. Efforts to trace his whereabouts through public records, utility accounts, or employment databases yielded nothing. Local hospitals, shelters, and morgues were contacted, but no matches were found. No one had seen him, and no official documentation placed him anywhere after the day of the disappearance. To investigators, it was as if he had vanished from existence entirely. Tate's family and friends remained adamant he was not capable of such violence. They described him as soft-spoken, law-abiding, and ill-equipped for criminal enterprise. But with no evidence to the contrary, and with Martin's body in the river, authorities could not eliminate him as either suspect or accomplice. Months elapsed. The cash was never recovered. The vehicle offered no further forensic leads. No fingerprints besides those of the regular crew were identified. No additional witnesses came forward. And while Martin's death was ruled a homicide, the investigation failed to connect it to any known criminal organization, pattern, or motive beyond the obvious theft. With each passing year, public interest diminished. The case was quietly moved to cold storage, its file thick with unanswered questions and contradictory theories. Rumors circulated, spawning urban legends of an armored car that vanished without trace, a man who disappeared without a past, and a murder with no fingerprints, no weapon, and no witness. Police never formally closed the case, but internally most believed it was beyond resolution. Yet beneath the unresolved mystery, one fact lingered, unshaken and unforgotten. Kenny Tate had vanished, and no one, not his family, not the police, not the press, had ever been able to explain how or why. In the summer of 2019, nearly 3 decades after the unexplained disappearance of an armored vehicle in Richmond, Virginia, a forgotten object changed hands in a quiet suburb of Austin, Texas. At a small estate sale held in the front yard of a modest home, journalist Jamal Riggs browsed through boxes of old clothing, dusty books, and household trinkets. Among the scattered items, he noticed a worn leather wallet. It was nothing special, aged, creased, and scuffed at the corners, but something about its untouched appearance made him pick it up. The seller, an elderly woman, mentioned that it had belonged to her late husband, Julius Nash, who had passed away in 2004. Riggs paid a few dollars and left without thinking much of the purchase. Only later that evening, as he emptied the wallet out of curiosity, did he find something unusual inside. Wedged behind a crumpled photograph and a couple of old coins was a single folded piece of paper. It was a rental receipt from a Richmond-based bank, stamped clearly with a date. June 1990. The name on the document was Julius Nash. The date caught Riggs's attention immediately. As a freelance journalist with a background in forgotten and unsolved cases, he recognized the month immediately. June 1990 had long been associated with the mysterious disappearance of an armored vehicle in Richmond, along with over $1 million in supermarket cash and 2 missing guards. One of them was later found dead in the James River. The other had never been seen again. The vehicle had turned up empty in an industrial zone, and no arrests were ever made. The case had gone cold by the mid-1990s and was considered one of Richmond's most enduring unsolved crimes. Riggs held the yellowed slip of paper in his hand and tried to process what he was seeing. A man with no official connections to the case had rented a safety deposit vault in Richmond the very same month the vehicle disappeared. No mention of Nash had ever surfaced in connection to the armored car case, but this receipt placed him in the same city at the same time, linked to a locked container that, as far as Riggs could tell, had never been opened. Driven by instinct and years of experience following leads others ignored, Riggs began to dig. He searched public records and newspaper archives for anything related to Julius Nash. What he found was sparse. Nash had a criminal record from the 1980s, including petty theft and possession charges. He had lived in Richmond during that time, but his name had dropped out of the public record by the early 1990s. The trail picked up again in the mid-2000s, when obituaries confirmed his death following an altercation with police during an unrelated investigation in another state. There were no mentions of large assets and no indication of what had become of the years between. What intrigued Riggs most wasn't Nash's criminal past, but the fact that the safety deposit vault still existed, at least on paper. The original bank that issued the receipt had changed hands several times over the years, eventually becoming part of a larger financial group. Through a series of phone calls and municipal archive searches, Riggs confirmed that the vault facility still operated under a different name. More importantly, he learned that Vault 147, rented by Nash in June 1990, had never been officially closed. The rent had gone unpaid for decades, but due to banking policy at the time, the contents had not been seized or inventoried. The vault was technically still active, just dormant, untouched since the week it was rented. This detail shifted everything. The safety deposit vault, preserved by bureaucratic oversight and decades of neglect, now represented a potential time capsule from the exact moment the armored vehicle vanished. The more Riggs thought about it, the more it seemed improbable that such a detail could be purely coincidental. A man with a criminal background rents a vault the same month $1 million disappears, then drops from the public eye. The connection might have been thin, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Riggs knew he couldn't open the vault himself. Legally, he had no claim. Legally, it belonged to the estate of Julius Nash, and any rights to it would have passed to Nash's widow, who had unknowingly sold him the wallet. But as a journalist, Riggs understood how to navigate public records and trigger institutional attention. He began reaching out to legal contacts and court clerks in Richmond to determine whether the vault had ever been flagged as abandoned or subject to probate. If its contents had remained untouched since 1990 and the estate had never filed a claim, there might still be a path to petition for its inspection, especially if there was a credible reason to believe it contained evidence tied to an unsolved felony. At the same time, he kept returning to the wallet. The photographs inside showed a younger Nash with people Riggs couldn't identify. One image had a car in the background, with Virginia plates. Another showed Nash standing beside what appeared to be an auto repair garage. None of it was conclusive, but all of it pointed in one direction: Richmond, early 1990s. What started as a casual purchase now felt like a trailhead to something buried deep. Not just a cold case, but a secret someone had tried to lock away and leave behind. The receipt wasn't just a scrap of paper, it was a timestamp, a bridge back to a moment when a vehicle, 2 men, and over $1 million vanished without explanation. Riggs had no idea what the vault would contain, or if it would contain anything at all. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This lead was real, and it was the closest anyone had come in decades to opening a door that had remained shut since 1990. And the key, as it turned out, had been sitting in an old wallet, untouched for nearly 30 years. The unique circumstances, a rental record matching the month of the heist, the renter's known criminal history, and the lack of any official closure of the deposit vault, created a compelling argument. Working through the appropriate legal channels, Riggs helped facilitate a formal request for the vault to be opened under court supervision. The process took several weeks. The vault facility, now operated by a successor bank, confirmed that Vault 147 had indeed remained unopened since June 1990. Though the rental fees had long since gone unpaid, the contents had never been cataloged or removed. Under judicial authorization, a team was assembled to carry out the opening of the vault. Present were 2 representatives of the storage facility, a local police investigator, a forensic technician, and 2 impartial witnesses. Riggs was not allowed in the room during the operation, but he waited nearby, knowing that whatever was inside could potentially reignite a case that had been dormant for nearly 3 decades. The vault itself was unremarkable, a standard steel compartment tucked within a long wall of identical units. Once unlocked, the door swung open smoothly. Inside, neatly stacked and bound, were packs of United States currency. The bills were clean, crisp, and still wrapped in the original banking straps. A quick visual inspection confirmed that the bundles bore the same insignia and formatting used by the bank in 1990. There was nothing else inside the vault. No letters, no identification, no documents of any kind, just the cash, counted and verified on site to total $94,000. Despite the lack of additional contents, the significance of the discovery was immediate. This was the first verifiable physical link to the stolen funds from the armored vehicle robbery. Forensic analysis of the bills began at once. The serial numbers were cross-referenced with archival records maintained by the Richmond Police Department and Southern Federal Bank. The match was exact. These bills had been listed among the stolen assets in the original police report from 1990. With the confirmation of the bill's origin, the Richmond Police Department officially reopened the case. The news was kept from the public as investigators retraced steps long thought forgotten. The first focus was Julius Nash. According to archived residential records, Nash had lived in Richmond in 1990. He had a criminal record, including multiple charges for petty theft and probation violations. Records indicated that in 1989, Nash had served a suspended sentence and had been placed under supervised release. Further examination of employment archives revealed that Nash had participated in a workforce reintegration program that placed him in a local auto repair shop. The shop, operational at the time but since closed, had also employed a young part-time worker named Kenny Tate, the same man who had vanished without explanation alongside the armored vehicle. Personnel rosters and payroll records confirmed that both men were on site during the same months in 1989. This was the first direct link between the missing guard and the man whose safety deposit vault now held stolen money. Investigators located photographs from a community outreach newsletter published by the reintegration program. One image showed a group of workers posing in front of the garage, with both Nash and Tate clearly visible among them. Although no evidence yet indicated criminal intent, it established beyond dispute that the 2 men knew each other well before the heist. Until this point, no documentation had ever suggested a relationship between them. Digging further, detectives discovered that 2 months after the robbery, in August 1990, Nash had quietly purchased a used cargo van from a private seller in Chesterfield County, just outside Richmond. The vehicle was paid for in cash. Title records showed no lien, no trade-in, and no financing. Within weeks of the purchase, Nash left the area. There were no tax filings, no new utility registrations, and no property acquisitions under his name in Virginia after that date. Tracing his movements post-1990 proved difficult. Nash had avoided all traditional indicators. He did not register new vehicles, did not acquire credit cards, and left behind no employment history that could be verified through standard databases. He surfaced again only in a police incident report from 2004 involving an attempted arrest in another state. That confrontation ended in his death, and no investigation at the time had tied him to the armored vehicle case. Despite the years that had passed, forensic analysts examined the storage vault and packaging for latent prints or trace evidence. While degradation was expected, partial prints were successfully lifted from the inner lip of the vault door. Initial results were inconclusive, but further testing showed points of match with known fingerprint samples taken from Nash's earlier arrest records. The match helped confirm that Nash had personally accessed the vault. With all the pieces now visible in alignment, Nash's confirmed connection to Tate, the unbroken trail from the wallet to the deposit vault, the dated currency in its original wrappings, and the cash-only vehicle purchase following the robbery, investigators reevaluated the theory of a lone perpetrator. The probability that Nash had acted independently now seemed remote. More critically, police began to consider whether Kenny Tate had truly vanished as a victim or whether he had in fact collaborated in the crime and disappeared by design. Until now, his status as a missing person had shielded him from deeper suspicion. But the reemergence of a financial trail suggested intent, planning, and coordination, all elements inconsistent with a spontaneous act or coerced participation. The recovered money may have represented only a fraction of the stolen total, but it broke a silence that had lasted nearly 30 years. For the first time since 1990, investigators had names, timelines, and tangible proof of foundation from which to pursue the full story behind one of Richmond's most elusive crimes. The evidence was no longer just anecdotal or speculative. It was real, countable, and verifiable. And it pointed back to a conspiracy that had waited decades in the shadows, just beneath the surface, preserved in a forgotten metal container. As investigators continued reviewing Julius Nash's background, a lead emerged that shifted the direction of the reopened case. A retired law enforcement officer from Texas contacted Richmond authorities after learning about the revived investigation. He recalled a man named Carlton Brooks, who had surfaced in the Houston area in 1991 and purchased a small auto repair shop entirely in cash. At the time, Brooks had presented documents listing Atlanta as his previous residence, but his background appeared vague. Though no red flags were raised then, the profile now stood out in light of new connections between Nash and the 1990 armored vehicle heist. Detectives began examining Brooks more closely. His property records confirmed the purchase of the garage. In 1991, the transaction was conducted in full cash with no mortgage, no financing, and no prior credit activity in the state. There were no tax filings or utilities tied to his name before that point, and the documentation he submitted appeared newly issued. His driver's license had been obtained in Georgia shortly before the purchase, but investigators were unable to locate any supporting records that would confirm residency there. Everything about Brooks's history prior to Texas seemed manufactured or intentionally minimal. As part of the background check, investigators pulled customer service documents and employee registration forms filed in Brooks's name during his early years of business. His signature appeared repeatedly across permits, inspections, and invoices. Analysts compared these samples to archived personnel documents signed by Kenny Tate in 1990 while employed by Atlantic Secure Transit A forensic handwriting specialist, confirmed a strong correlation between the two. While not definitive, the handwriting alone raised serious questions about Brooks's true identity. Additional details strengthened the suspicion. Brooks's stated birth year and physical description matched what Kenny Tate's would have been archival photographs from Tate's employment file were placed alongside an image of Brooks from a state-issued driver's license. The similarities were clear. similar facial structure, build, and complexion. Individually, none of the indicators were conclusive, but together, signature, appearance, timeline, and the unexplained cash purchase, they presented a pattern investigators could no longer ignore. At this stage, the accumulated evidence, handwriting comparison, age and appearance match, and the timeline of Brooks's arrival in Texas was strong enough to warrant legal action. Investigators secured a court-approved warrant and moved forward. In early 2020, Carlton Brooks was arrested at his auto repair shop without incident. He did not resist, did not protest, and showed no signs of surprise. He was taken into custody and transferred to Richmond for formal processing and questioning. As part of routine intake procedures, a biological sample was collected. Investigators arranged for a comparative DNA analysis using a voluntary genetic sample provided by Kenny Tate's mother, now elderly and living in North Carolina. The test was processed by a certified forensic laboratory and returned a clear result. The maternal match confirmed that Carlton Brooks and Kenny Tate were the same individual. After nearly 3 decades, the long-missing armored vehicle guard had been found, not buried, not abducted, but living quietly under a new name in another state. With the confirmation in hand, detectives reviewed the timeline of Tate's life under the alias. Records showed that Brooks had purchased the auto shop less than 6 months after the disappearance. The sale had been conducted entirely in cash. There were no tax filings from the year before, no credit history, and no banking activity under either name. Brooks's known assets included only the garage and a modest residence nearby. Investigators found no travel history, no firearm registrations, and no business expansions. Everything pointed to a calculated effort to maintain a low profile. His lifestyle was cautious, his footprint minimal. It became evident that Tate had structured his new identity around discretion and invisibility. Following his identification, Brooks was interviewed by detectives. He acknowledged his true identity and confirmed his involvement in the 1990 armored vehicle theft. He admitted that he and Julius Nash had worked together to plan the operation in advance. According to his statement, the original objective was limited to theft, the removal of cash from the vehicle without violence. He claimed that the plan was never intended to result in injury or death. During the initial interview, he declined to offer further details about the sequence of events, the role each man played, or the aftermath of the incident. Although the confession established participation, questions remained about the precise chain of events, the role of each individual, and the moment the operation had turned fatal. But the complete story of that day in June 1990, from the moment the vehicle left the depot to the discovery of a body in the James River, would require careful reconstruction, which investigators were now prepared to begin. For the first time since the disappearance, investigators had both a living participant and a confirmed narrative linked to the crime. For nearly 30 years, the disappearance of Kenny Tate had been treated as an open question. Now, with the confirmation of his identity and his arrest, the mystery shifted from one of absence to one of accountability. The case was no longer about where he had gone, but what exactly had happened that morning, and how a man had managed to disappear into a new life without leaving a trace. In the days following his arrest, Tate remained cautious in his statements. His initial interrogation produced only a partial admission. He acknowledged his identity and involvement in the theft, but refused to elaborate. However, after being presented with the full scope of evidence, including the DNA confirmation, the vault money from the deposit vault, and archived links to Julius Nash, Tate agreed to a second interview. This time, under formal questioning and legal counsel, he gave investigators a more detailed account. Based on his testimony and cross-referenced with archival data, police were finally able to reconstruct the events of June 12, 1990. On the morning of June 12, 1990, the Atlantic Secure Transit Armored Vehicle departed from its depot in Richmond, Virginia, to complete its scheduled pickup route. The vehicle was manned by 2 employees. Elroy Martin, a seasoned driver with more than 15 years of experience in cash transport, and Kenny Tate, a new hire still in the early stages of his probationary period. The pair had been assigned a standard route, collecting funds from regional supermarket branches before transferring the full amount to the Southern Federal Bank. As the vehicle completed its series of pickups and began the final leg of its route, Martin reportedly noticed the faint but distinct smell of gasoline inside the cab. The odor had not been present at the beginning of the shift. According to Tate's statement, he had poured a small quantity of gasoline into a concealed space beneath the rubber floor mat in the early hours of the morning before the vehicle left the depot. The amount had been carefully measured, not enough to raise immediate alarm, but sufficient to cause discomfort and raise suspicion of a mechanical problem once the cabin heated up during the drive. According to Tate, once Martin noticed the odor, Tate proposed a brief stop, claiming to know a nearby mechanic who could take a quick look and check for a potential fuel leak without delaying the schedule. Martin, concerned about safety and acting on his responsibility as the senior officer, agreed to divert briefly from their planned route. They left the main road and entered a sparsely populated industrial area on the city's outskirts, turning into the lot of an abandoned warehouse that had once been used for commercial storage. The area offered concealment and lacked nearby businesses or pedestrian traffic. Martin parked the vehicle and stepped out to check underneath the chassis. At that moment, from the shadows between the buildings, Julius Nash appeared. He was armed. Martin, recognizing that something was wrong, reached for his service weapon. Before he could draw, Nash fired. The shot struck Martin in the back of the head at close range. He collapsed near the front of the vehicle. There were no witnesses and no one in the area to hear the sound. Tate, by his own account, was inside the rear compartment at the time of the shooting, already in the process of moving the bags of cash from the armored vault into a secondary vehicle, a used cargo van that Nash had positioned nearby the night before. When he emerged and saw Martin's body, he claimed to have frozen, shocked by what had happened. Nash, according to Tate's statement, urged him to continue. Under pressure and fearing for his own safety, Tate finished the transfer of funds. The pair then loaded Martin's body into the van, covered it with a tarp, and exited the area using side roads that avoided commercial corridors. Later that night, under cover of darkness, they drove to a remote stretch of the James River and disposed of Martin's body, weighing it down with debris collected from the riverbank before pushing it into the current. The weapon Nash used to shoot Martin was never found. According to Tate, Nash kept it with him when they left the scene, and he had no knowledge of its fate. With the body submerged and the vehicle left abandoned in the industrial zone, the armored vehicle was found the next day with no signs of forced entry and no evidence of a struggle. The vault had been opened using internal access, and the entire cash load, valued at over $1.1 million, was gone. The cash was split on the spot immediately after the robbery. Tate took his portion and disappeared, cutting off all ties to Nash. He traveled to Texas under the false identity of Carlton Brooks, purchased a garage in cash, and began a new life centered around discretion and stability. He avoided banks, credit cards, and anything that could trigger scrutiny. According to Tate, Nash had informed him during the planning stages that the getaway vehicle would not be kept after the operation. The intention was to avoid leaving any traceable link. After the robbery, Nash drove the van to a small independent auto salvage yard outside the city, where it was dismantled and sold off in parts. Nash, on the other hand, remained active under his real name, eventually moving between states and continuing to operate in the margins of legality until his death during an unrelated police encounter in 2004. The plan, as Tate described it, had never been designed to end in violence. The use of the gasoline odor was meant to create a plausible technical issue that would allow them to stop the vehicle without suspicion. Nash's decision to bring a weapon and ultimately to use it had not been part of the original strategy. At least, according to Tate Still, investigators noted that neither man had attempted to report the incident or seek help after the fact. The decision to hide the body, abandon the vehicle, and divide the stolen money marked a clear choice to treat the situation as a completed crime rather than a failed plan. One of the more telling details was Nash's decision to place part of his share, $94,000, in a safety deposit vault rented just days after the robbery. That single act, likely intended as a way to safeguard a portion of the funds while avoiding detection, would eventually unravel the entire operation. The bank receipt, forgotten inside his wallet, and later discovered by chance at a garage sale, became the thread that pulled the case back into the light after nearly 30 years of silence. The final stages of the reconstruction brought clarity to a case long defined by confusion. The missing fates of the guards, the untouched vehicle, the lack of evidence, all of it made sense once the full sequence was laid out. Tate's confession filled in the gaps left by the original investigation. And although Nash was no longer alive to face justice, the role he played in the planning, execution, and escalation of the crime had finally been exposed. In early 2021, following a months-long legal process and a careful review of evidence, Kenny Tate was formally convicted in a Richmond court on 4 felony counts. The charges included armed robbery, identity fraud, obstruction of justice, and money laundering. Because the murder was committed by Nash and not Tate, and no evidence suggested that Tate had planned or assisted in the killing, prosecutors determined that homicide charges would not be pursued. The lack of physical evidence, including the murder weapon, and the absence of eyewitness testimony made it impossible to establish Tate's legal culpability in Martin's death. In the end, the court sentenced Tate to 18 years in a federal correctional facility. The money recovered from the Richmond Safety Deposit Vault, $94,000, was formally processed as recovered property and returned to the financial custody of the parties involved, including representatives of the supermarket chains whose proceeds had been stolen. Though a fraction of the full stolen amount, the sum served as both evidence and symbolic restitution. The remainder of the money, over $1 million, was presumed to have been spent, laundered, or unrecoverable. Investigators concluded that Tate had lived modestly under his alias and that most financial traces had long since vanished. Julius Nash's posthumous role in the crime was confirmed through circumstantial evidence. His fingerprints had been found on the interior lid of the deposit vault, matching archived prints from his criminal file. The vault had been rented in his name during the same week. The armored vehicle vanished. Financial records indicated no legitimate reason for him to possess large sums of cash during that period. Photographic archives established a previous acquaintance between Nash and Tate through their shared time at an auto garage in 1989. All of this built a picture of joint planning and execution. Though Nash could not be prosecuted, having died during an unrelated arrest in 2004, the Richmond Police Department formally closed his case as co-conspirator and probable gunman in the Martin killing. When investigators initially reopened the case in 2019, they contacted Nash's widow regarding the newly discovered rental receipt. At the time, she claimed to have no knowledge of the deposit vault or its contents. She stated that her late husband had never spoken of Richmond, nor had he ever mentioned the bank or a connection to Kenny Tate. The woman, who had sold the old wallet at a garage sale, unaware of its significance, was not charged with any offense. Police determined that she had not accessed or even known about the existence of the vault. Her name did not appear on any documentation linked to the vault, and she had never visited the bank facility. For the Richmond Police Department, the resolution of the case was seen as both a breakthrough and a cautionary tale. The 1990 armored vehicle disappearance had long been considered a cold case. its lack of evidence and abrupt ending having frustrated multiple generations of investigators. That a missing piece surfaced through an object as mundane as an old wallet underscored the unpredictable nature of dormant cases. The fact that the receipt had survived nearly 3 decades and eventually landed in the hands of someone willing to pursue it shifted the trajectory of the investigation entirely. For Jamal Riggs, the story of the lost receipt and the buried money marked a turning point in his career. Riggs published a detailed account of the case, chronicling the steps that led from a neighborhood garage sale to a reopened investigation and federal conviction. The case gained traction beyond Virginia, and Riggs was soon invited to collaborate on investigative projects with national media outlets, solidifying his reputation as a journalist who could find cracks in even the most time-worn cases. His persistence in tracing the chain of events, filing legal inquiries, and liaising with law enforcement played a pivotal role in unearthing the truth. In the final report submitted to the Federal Archive, the case was officially marked as resolved. Elroy Martin's family received formal notification along with a summary of the findings. While no new compensation was granted beyond prior insurance claims, they were provided with the full investigative file, including the forensic timeline, testimony excerpts, and confirmation of Tate's conviction. His death, once treated as an unsolvable tragedy, had now been framed within an intelligible sequence of events. The closing of the case offered closure to multiple parties, and for the public, it was a reminder that sometimes justice arrives slowly, but arrives nonetheless. A weathered receipt tucked inside a forgotten wallet had unraveled a case no one expected to solve. What began as a quiet purchase at a garage sale had brought to light the truth behind a $1 million disappearance, a hidden identity, and a long-overlooked murder. The silence that had surrounded the case for 30 years had finally been broken.